Hi, I'm Brent. Today we've got a fantastic update for you, which is all about the technology changes due to demand for chasing the holy grail of more and more power with your turbo Subaru EJ series engine. And in front of me, I've got the Willall Racing Billet block assembly, which has already got the rotating assembly inside it. We'll talk about that in a minute. And beside it, we've got an example of a standard Subaru EJ25 engine. So what we're going to do in the next 5 or 10 minutes is just show you the difference between the two assemblies so you can understand what Subaru have done with their cast alloy short block assembly and what Willall Racing have achieved with their billet block assembly. You've got to remember, this is all cast production parts, obviously for the EJ series engines for 2.5, and the Willall Racing one is machined out on the CNC machine out of a solid block of billet aluminium. And we'll talk about the differences in detail in a second. But one of the big things that people are always chasing is more horsepower and more torque. And the big limitations of a lot of this is just block strength. And what we're going to do is we'll show you the differences between all the components before we start assembling this engine. And then the next series of a couple of weeks, we're going to build this engine together, show you exactly what the differences are so you can get a bit more of an idea of what to expect for your chosen upgrades in the future. You may not opt for one of these block assemblies because they are a fairly sizable investment, whereas it'll still help you understand the traps and pitfalls and strengths and weaknesses with the Subaru EJ25. So let's just start from the start. What we've got is the Subaru short block, which hasn't got the heads fitted at the moment. Front of the crankshaft assembly is normally in here, but at the moment the only thing on this one, it hasn't got a crank in it, so normally the crankshaft's at the front, timing belt assembly at the front of there, radiator, gearbox at the back. So remember, when you've got a Subaru engine, it's effectively two halves, because to get the crank out of the middle, you've got to break the two halves apart, and therein lie one of the weaknesses on the 2.5 or even the 2-litre engines when you're really pushing them hard from a power and performance point of view. With the Willall block assembly, you can see we've already fitted the crankshaft. Now this one they are designed for a lot of replacement factory or aftermarket parts because there's so many components on it which just bolt straight together, and that's one of the great features of this block assembly. But in our spec of our engine build, we've opted for a 2.6 stroker assembly with a brand new crankshaft, pistons, rods, bearings, and all that kind of stuff. And we'll show you some of the internal components in a minute. Client wanted just a little bit more torque, and from a convenience point of view, it was easier for us to go for the 2.6. So let's have a close look at what's different from the top of the engine, because remember, on the top of this, you've normally got the inlet manifold and the top-mounted intercooler, which sits above at the back. So Subaru, when they cast their engines, as you can see, there's a lot of material that is not as included, which affects the strength of the block. Whereas the parent material that Willall start with, they start with one solid block of aluminium, which is a completely different way of machining a block assembly as opposed to casting it. So what they've got to do is take everything away to effectively end up with this design of the engine, whereas Subaru, it's all cast, and obviously the requirements from a manufacturing process are completely different. So you can see just here alone, the top of the engine where it bolts together. With the Willall assembly, they've got a lot more stronger bolts assembly in here, whereas obviously in the Subaru one, you can see the difference just in here alone. There's a lot more parent material to make the block a lot more stiffer in this assembly, and you can see by just these parts here compared to the billet assembly where there's absolutely no voids at all. And of course, just down inside here, there's a whole heap of variations there alone. But also, just look at the thickness of the parts of the cast of the block that bolts onto the back of the transmission, and you can see here by comparing it just how much more material there is on this block, which gives you a hell of a lot more stiffness to able to push a lot more horsepower, because when you're pushing these engines really hard, it's the block stiffness that allows you to get the grunt, because things don't move around as much when you're pushing those big amounts of grunt. So let's just turn the block over, and this is where some of the things become really, really obvious. So in our assembly, being an aluminium engine, you can't have a piston sliding up and down in a raw aluminium block. you've got to either, in the case of Subaru, have a lining inside the aluminium for the friction material of the pistons and the rings to slide up and down, whereas on the billet block assembly, the typical only alternative is to go for cylinder liners, which you then are inserted into the aluminium. Now, these liners are a common upgrade for an aftermarket assembly in this type of material with the original factory Subaru engine. But when you fit these liners, you can see the steel part of the liner, which is like a piece of pipe that goes down inside the bore of the block. You've got to machine a lot of material out to fit that in. So the downside is, and this is one of the critical areas when you're thinking about upgrading your engines, when you bore all of this material out to insert the liner, you're taking away a lot of the material which forms the stiffness and makes the block strong to start with. And of course, effectively, inherently, what you're doing is weakening the block to allow to insert the liner to give you then the benefits of what you chose to do the liner for. Now, you might be putting liners in there because the block is beyond repair, or it's gone oversized and you can't bore it out anymore, or you might be going for a stroker upgrade or this kind of stuff. Now, we've spoken in the past about the differences between closed deck blocks and open deck blocks, and I encourage you to have a look at that video, but from a brevity point of view, with the 2.5 litre engine, they're effectively an open deck block, and this part of the casting here, which has been machined down to put the head on, you can see is what connects the original factory Subaru bore to the outer shell, and inside here is where all the water jacket runs to cool the engine when the engine's operating, because this is all full of water. But this part here is what stabilizes the liner or the piston bore assembly when the engine is operating. Now, when you push these engines really hard, even before you even think about putting a liner in there, this can distort under high load. And of course, if you're pushing big horsepower, you actually get movement between this surface here, the head gasket, and then the head itself, which ultimately then causes a weakness in the head gasket assembly, which can then cause head gasket failure. Or ultimately, what can also happen is this liner here, which is supposed to be perfectly round for the piston and the rings to slide up and down in, as the engine is operating and it's distorting due to load, it goes out of round, and then you get blow-by issues. You don't get nice good seal between the rings and the bores, and these are all the things that have an effect on the performance of the engine and how much grunt and power you can get out of it. Now, of course, the solution is to put a liner in there, which is inherently stiffer in itself because of the way it's designed. But the downside is when you put that liner in the block, you've then got to locate that liner in the block in a way that will make it last. Now, one of the other problems, and just get you have a look, when you bore all of this material out and you're not left much of it when you bore it out to put the liner in, this part down the very bottom there is what the liner sits on, of which is then sandwiched with the head gasket. Now, the downside is of the normal Subaru EJ series engines, it is known for the liners in some situations to seat down into the bottom of that bore assembly over a period of time just due to load, and then that causes other head gasket problems as well. Whereas on the billet block assembly, which I can't show you because the liner and the pistons are in place, underneath there where the liner is seated is a lot more parent material, which effectively gives a hell of a lot more reliable future peace of mind in knowing that the liner will not sit down or relieve itself into the block assembly at all. But let's just look at some of the other areas. Look at the amount of material, and this is one of the huge advantages of the billet block, the amount of material around the liner, and also, which you can't see in the video, but I'll show you in a still photo, is that parent material which supports the liner goes way down inside the block assembly itself. Whereas when you put in that same liner in a Subaru EJ20 or an EJ25 block assembly, that liner does not have anywhere near the same amount of support. So the risk is the liner will move around inside the block after you've built your engine. And of course, all of this area here also increases the amount of surface area for the head gasket to mate on, gives you an increase in reliability from the design of the head gasket material, and of course when the block comes down from the top. Now the other thing is also, you can see these bolt holes here with the threads down inside, and compare that to the same size holes or smaller size holes on a Subaru assembly, which is what holds the head down. again, a hell of a lot bigger in diameter. You can run a lot more thicker bolt assembly to hold the head down. Of course, you can crank that down a lot harder to run higher combustion pressures, and these are all some of the other little things you can think of. The downside, again, when you machine these holes out here to run bigger head studs, or what typically a lot of people run are 14mm head studs, you're again taking away the parent material, whereas with this block assembly you've got so much more parent material to play with, and of course the block comes pre-machined with those types of threaded holes already. So let's just turn the block over again one bit more, and now we're looking at the underside, and of course this is where the sump is. So the sump normally sits on top of here. You have the oil cooler assembly with the oil filter, and sits on top of this. And just look at the amount of material in here, and this assembly here, which is the web and the crankshaft, sits down in between these castings here. And then just look at the billet block assembly. You can see there's an additional locating bolts here to hold it all together, to give you more strength from a stiffness point of view. And of course that's not evident in the Subaru factory engine. And also this part here, which is also increases the stiffness. The material goes down there, which is included material in the billet assembly, whereas in the Subaru engine, all under here is all hollow. Because you've got to remember, Subaru, when they build these engines, it's a balance between the weight of the engine from an overall vehicle weight point of view, from a fuel economy, the casting limitations. When they build these engines from a cast point of view, there is a limitation to what you can achieve out of a cast process of building them in the factory. Whereas when you're doing it from a raw scratch point of view, there's a hell of a lot more opportunities. And you can see just in around here, the physical thickness of the material is so much bigger. Have a look around here and then compare that, just on that side alone, just compare the amount of material in the block there from a stiffness point of view and compare it to the original factory Subaru engine, and it starts becoming pretty obvious why these engines can be rated to well over 1,000 horsepower. So let's then turn it over a bit more, and of course we're back on the other side of the engine and you can see what we've spoken about before. So there you have it. These are just some of the reasons why you may choose to go for a billet block assembly on your Subaru engine rebuild. Depending on the rotating assembly you put in these engines, Willall Racing have rated them to well over 1,000 horsepower, and of course depending on the supplementary parts that you then hang off the engine will have a lot of effect on what you can achieve. We've got a lot of other goodies to still build to this engine to progress it to the next step. Turbo, inlet manifold, the design of the pistons and rods are one of the big things, and also just the clearances you can run. You can run these engines with a lot tighter clearances because we know things are not going to move around as much, and of course that adds to those critical steps of increasing in performance, and all these little things are what add together. So there you have it. That's the difference between the raw short block assembly from a billet block compared to original factory Subaru cast block. Check out our next video, which I'll show you. We'll start bolting the heads together and show you some of the other differences in the engine design. And I hope this is certainly going to help you no matter where you are in the world. Check out our website. Of course, from our point of view, we do a lot of engine rebuilds and a lot of engine upgrades. You can put Shortblock into the search command at the top of the MRT website and search the components, or you can put just billet and you'll find that as well. But of course you can follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter and Instagram, and we'll keep you updated as soon as we can. Bye for now.